Hi, my name is Mike Anderson. I'm 38 years old and have spent the last 15 years working as a civil engineer. For most of my life, I lived in big cities, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic, towering skyscrapers, and the never ending hustle of urban life. But a few years ago, especially after the pandemic, I started craving a quieter, more peaceful lifestyle. So, my wife Sarah brought 10-year-old son Ethan, and I decided to leave the concrete jungle behind and move to a small suburban neighborhood in the Midwest. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start: quiet streets, wide green lawns, and friendly neighbors. At first glance, everything was perfect. Neighbors waved as we moved in, kids rode their bikes down the tree lined streets, and the air smelled of freshly cut grass and summer barbecues. It felt like we had found our little slice of American paradise. But it didn't take long for me to realize that beneath this picturesque facade, something was off. This peaceful suburb was actually a small scale dictatorship. And at the center of it all was the HOA Homeowners Association president, Todd. Todd, a man in his early 50s with short gray hair and a collection of perfectly pressed polo shirts, looked like a typical suburban dad. But beneath his seemingly ordinary appearance was a man obsessed with power. Todd was the worst kind of leader, someone who loved control but hated accountability. He ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, enforcing petty rules with ridiculous precision. For example, he would slap a $200 fine on anyone who left their trash cans out a minute past 9 a.m. Yet when it came to his own property, Todd had no problem ignoring the rules. His yard was cluttered with unapproved structures, his fence stood taller than the city allowed, and he had an old truck parked in his driveway, a clear violation of the HOA guidelines. But Todd's real crime was much worse. He was using the HOA's funds as his personal piggy bank. During my first few weeks in the neighborhood, I quietly observed my surroundings and listened to the whispered complaints of my new neighbors. Everyone seemed to know Todd's name, but no one dared to confront him. Kids slowed down when riding their bikes past his house. Dog owners kept their pets from wandering near his lawn. And even the mailman made his deliveries with noticeable haste. It became clear to me that Todd was the unchallenged tyrant of our little community, a silent dictator ruling through intimidation and fear. But if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that bullies only win when good people stay silent. And I, Mike Anderson, was not about to stay silent. After settling into our new home, I made an effort to fit into the neighborhood. I started attending community barbecues, chatting with my neighbors, and even joined the local softball league. I wanted to build connections and feel like part of this tight knit community. But as much as I tried to focus on the positives, one thing kept bothering me: Todd. Todd was a constant presence, his influence felt in every corner of the neighborhood. He seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere. The more I heard about him, the more I realized that his grip on the community was stronger than I first thought. He had built a small empire based on fear, control, and intimidation, and most residents had simply accepted it as the price of living in this otherwise beautiful place. Then, my first personal clash with Todd happened, and it was over something as simple as a fence. Our backyard fence had taken a beating over the years. The paint had faded, and a few of the wooden panels were starting to crack. I decided it was time for a fresh coat of paint, so I checked the HO's list of approved colors. However, the specific shade required for fences in our neighborhood, a dull, weathered gray, was out of stock at every hardware store within a 50-mile radius. I went with the closest match I could find, thinking it wouldn't be a big deal. A week later, I found a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. It stated that my fence was not painted in the approved color and that I had 14 days to fix the problem or face a $500 fine. I felt my blood pressure spike. This had to be a mistake. I'd followed the guidelines as best as I could. I tried to reason with Todd at the next HOA meeting. I brought my receipts, showed him pictures of the empty shelves at the hardware stores, and even pointed out that several other fences in the neighborhood weren't painted in the exact shade either. I expected a reasonable response, maybe even a bit of understanding. But Todd just leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and gave me a smug smile. "Rules are rules, Mike," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. If we start making exceptions for you, we'd have to make them for everyone. We can't have chaos. I felt my jaw clench. I looked around the room, hoping for some backup from the other homeowners, but everyone avoided my gaze. Todd had trained them well. No one wanted to challenge the king. That was the moment I realized something important. I wasn't just dealing with a petty bureaucrat, I was facing a full blown tyrant. And if I was going to take him down, I needed to play the long game. I walked out of that meeting with a new determination. Todd may have thought he had won that little skirmish, but I was just getting started. I had dealt with difficult people before, and I knew that taking down a bully required patience, strategy, and a whole lot of persistence. As I walked back to my house that evening, I glanced at my faded fence and felt a small flicker of defiance. Todd had no idea what was coming his way. After my first confrontation with Todd, I realized that taking him down would require a careful, calculated approach. I couldn't just storm into HOA meetings and start making accusations without evidence that would only make me look like a troublemaker. No, if I was going to bring Todd down, I needed to play the long game. I had to get inside his little kingdom and understand exactly how he operated. First, I needed to blend in. I made it a point to show up at every community event, barbecues, block parties, even the neighborhood's painfully awkward talent show. I chatted with the old couples who spent their mornings tending their flower beds, helped neighbors move furniture, and joined the local dads in their weekly poker games. I even volunteered to coach Ethan's Little League team. If I was going to gather allies, I needed people to see me as more than just a new guy. Then came the second part of my plan, infiltrating the HOA board. At the next quarterly HOA meeting, I stood up and offered to volunteer for an open board position. I played the part of the eager, naive newcomer perfectly. I talked about wanting to give back to the community and be more involved in our neighborhood's future. Todd, sitting at the head of the table like a smug king on his throne, raised an eyebrow but didn't object. In fact, he seemed almost amused, as if he couldn't wait to watch me drown in the endless sea of HOA paperwork. What Todd didn't realize was that I thrive in chaos. I had spent years managing multi-million dollar construction projects, dealing with contractors, budgets, and permits. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. Once I was officially on the board, I made it my mission to attend every single meeting, take meticulous notes, and quietly observe Todd's methods. I quickly realized that Todd ran the HOA like a medieval fiefdom. He ruled through a mix of intimidation and exhaustion, drowning the other board members in so much paperwork that they barely had time to question his decisions. He would push votes through when his closest allies were present, ignore motions from those who opposed him, and conveniently lose paperwork submitted by anyone who challenged his authority. Todd controlled the meeting agendas, decided what issues were worth discussing, and always found a way to steer conversations in his favor. If someone tried to bring up a complaint, he'd cut them off with a smile and a reminder to stick to the agenda. Todd had built a small inner circle of loyal supporters, mostly older residents who believed in a strict, order above all approach. These were the people who would back him up in votes, parrot his talking points, and silence dissenters. Todd was a master at using the HOA's own rules to his advantage. He knew every bylaw, every loophole, and every obscure clause that allowed him to maintain his iron grip on the neighborhood. Despite his bravado, Todd was deeply paranoid about losing control. He never allowed financial records to be freely shared, and he kept the HOA's finances as opaque as possible. Any attempt to access budget information was met with delays, excuses, or outright stonewalling. Armed with this knowledge, I began laying the groundwork for my plan. I started building alliances with other board members, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Todd's leadership. I reached out to homeowners who had clashed with Todd in the past, listening to their stories and encouraging them to speak up. I even created an anonymous email account and started sending out community updates, little newsletters highlighting the HOA's questionable spending, unexplained budget cuts, and the mysterious disappearance of funds that should have gone toward maintaining the community pool. I knew it would take time, but I was in this for the long haul. Todd may have been the self-proclaimed king of our little neighborhood, but I was about to become the quiet, patient force that would bring his empire crashing down. Once I had my foot in the door of the HOA board, I quickly realized that if I wanted to take Todd down, I needed to hit him where it hurt the most, his wallet. Todd had built his little empire on a foundation of control and intimidation, but every empire has a weakness. And in Todd's case, that weakness was money. Todd loved to brag about how he kept the HOA's finances tight and well managed. At every board meeting, he'd say things like, "Our community's financial health is strong and stable," before quickly moving on to the next topic. But there was a glaring contradiction. Our neighborhood's annual HOA dues were significantly higher than those of similar communities, yet our common areas were falling apart. The pool was closed for half the summer due to maintenance issues. The walking paths were poorly lit, and the grass in the communal areas was turning brown from neglect. This didn't make sense. How could a neighborhood collecting such high dues have such poorly maintained facilities? My first step was to review the HOA's financial records. However, Todd was incredibly reluctant to share these documents. I made a formal request for the records, citing the HOA bylaws that guaranteed homeowners the right to review financial information. But Todd responded with a series of excuses. The documents needed reorganization. The accounting software was being updated, and the records were temporarily unavailable. Realizing I wouldn't get far without more pressure, I started talking to my neighbors. I reached out to Bill, a retired Navy veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. He told me that since Todd had become HOA president, the dues had nearly doubled, while services had been cut in half. My next door neighbor, Lisa, claimed that Todd had used HOA funds to build a new patio at his house. Even the neighborhood kids had stories. They said they had seen Todd's children swimming in the closed for maintenance community pool. These stories were encouraging, but they weren't enough. I needed hard evidence to corner Todd. After months of pushing, Todd finally handed over the financial records, but they were a mess. Incomplete invoices, miscategorized expenses, and payments that made no sense. One line item in particular caught my eye: a $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company that didn't exist. Even more suspicious were the thousands of dollars listed as administrative expenses with no explanation whatsoever. I carefully combed through the stack of documents. At first glance, the records looked like a chaotic mix of legitimate expenses and poorly organized paperwork. But as I dug deeper, I found Todd's critical mistake. He had been funneling money into his personal accounts. I cross-referenced the HOA's bank statements with public records and hit the jackpot. Todd had been inflating contractor fees, pocketing the difference, and splitting the profits with a shady contractor friend who handled most of the neighborhood's maintenance work. I knew I had to be careful. If Todd got wind of what I was doing, he'd bury the evidence and double down on his intimidation tactics. I stored the financial documents in a locked filing cabinet in my basement and kept digital copies on a password-protected USB drive, which I hid inside an old toolbox in my garage. I couldn't afford to lose this information. I also started quietly talking to more of my neighbors. I asked if they ever wondered where their HOA dues were really going. Most of them seemed surprised. A few were skeptical, but several admitted that they had always suspected something wasn't right. Some even shared their own stories of being bullied or intimidated by Todd at board meetings. I listened carefully, took detailed notes, and added their accounts to my growing file of evidence. At this point, I wasn't just uncovering financial fraud, I was exposing a small dictatorship run on fear and manipulation. Todd had built a fortress of control, but he had made the critical mistake of underestimating his newest neighbor. With the financial evidence piling up, I knew it was time to start laying the groundwork for Todd's downfall, but I had to be patient. If I moved too soon, Todd would close ranks, destroy the records, and find a way to spin the narrative in his favor. I needed to wait for the perfect moment to strike when Todd was at his most vulnerable and least prepared. I had spent years managing complex construction projects, navigating layers of bureaucracy, and dealing with difficult clients. I was used to playing the long game. Todd might have been the self-proclaimed king of our little neighborhood, but I, Mike Anderson, was the quiet force that would bring his tiny empire crashing down. Now that I had a clearer picture of Todd's financial schemes, I needed hard evidence to bring him down. The financial records he had reluctantly handed over were a mess: incomplete invoices, miscategorized expenses, and thousands of dollars listed under vague terms like administrative fees. But as I carefully combed through the documents, a few key details jumped out at me. For instance, there was a $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company that didn't exist. There were also thousands of dollars labeled as administrative expenses with no clear explanation. These were the breadcrumbs I needed to follow. Todd had made a critical mistake. He had been funneling HOA funds into his personal accounts, inflating contractor fees, and splitting the profits with a shady contractor friend who handled most of the neighborhood's maintenance work. But collecting this evidence without raising suspicion required caution. If Todd realized what I was doing, he could destroy the records or prepare a counterattack. So I kept my findings locked in a filing cabinet in my basement, with digital copies stored on a password-protected USB drive hidden inside an old toolbox in my garage. I couldn't afford to lose this information. I also started talking to more of my neighbors, encouraging them to question where their HOA dues were really going. Some were surprised. A few were skeptical, but several had long suspected that something wasn't right. Some even shared their own stories of being bullied or intimidated by Todd at board meetings. I listened carefully, took detailed notes, and added their accounts to my growing file of evidence. With every piece of evidence I collected, I felt the walls closing in on Todd. I was no longer just exposing financial fraud. I was building a case against a small-time dictator who had ruled our neighborhood through fear and manipulation for far too long. With the evidence in hand, I knew the time to strike was approaching. The perfect opportunity came in the form of the annual HOA meeting, a normally dull affair attended by only a handful of homeowners. But this time, I was determined to pack the room. For weeks leading up to the meeting, I knocked on doors, chatted with my neighbors, and dropped just enough hints about Todd's shady dealings to stir their curiosity and anger. I didn't reveal everything, just enough to make sure they showed up. On the night of the meeting, the community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Todd, seated at the head of the table, started his usual opening speech about the strong financial health of the community. I could feel the tension in the room building. I stood up, holding the stack of documents I had spent months collecting. Todd, I have a few questions for you, I said, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the room's nervous chatter. Todd glanced up, his smug smile flickering for a moment. I don't think this is the time or place for that, he replied, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Actually, Todd, I said, stepping forward, this is exactly the time and place. I began handing out copies of the documents to everyone in the room. People started flipping through the pages, whispering to each other, then shouting. Todd's carefully crafted image of control was crumbling before my eyes. By the end of the night, Todd was removed from his position as HOA president. The board voted to bring in an independent auditor to examine the financial records, and within days, Todd's embezzlement was fully exposed. He didn't just lose his title, he found himself facing a lawsuit and possible criminal charges. I, Mike Anderson, had taken down a petty tyrant, and our neighborhood was finally free. With Todd officially removed from his throne, the final phase of my plan was to make sure he could never regain power. It wasn't enough to just kick him out. I needed to make an example out of him to send a message that no one, not even Todd, was above the rules. The independent auditor we hired quickly confirmed everything I had suspected. Todd had embezzled over $50,000, mismanaged tens of thousands more, and repeatedly used HOA funds for personal expenses. He had treated our community's money like his personal ATM, and now the paper trail was clear for everyone to see. I worked with the other board members to file a formal complaint with the county prosecutor's office. Todd was hit with charges of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The legal process moved quickly, and within weeks, Todd found himself facing not just the loss of his title, but also the potential loss of his freedom. But I didn't stop there. I made sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly what had happened. I printed out copies of the auditor's report and hand-delivered them to every house in the community. I also set up an online forum where homeowners could share their stories, voice their frustrations, and finally have a say in how our HOA was run. As the final nail in Todd's coffin, we updated the HOA laws to include strict financial oversight, term limits for board members, and a requirement that all financial records be made available to the entire community. Todd's little empire had crumbled, and I had made sure it could never rise again.